If there is a poster child for why we need groups like the Coalition to reduce spending, and the economic argument here is really important, folks. So we talked about that a little bit in the first segment with Jonathan Bydlak, the president therein. But this is crucial. No matter how you finance government, whether you tax, inflate, or borrow, it comes out of the private sector. Don't think you can do it. Now, we're all for lower taxes. But indeed, you're only going to get a supply-side spinoff or runoff or a growth in the economy to cover so much. If you cut taxes by 20%, but you quadruple or increase spending tenfold, you're not going to grow out of that, folks, and that's where we are right now. So the only answer, so you're going to be running massive deficits, and once interest rates go back to their normal levels, it is going to be unsustainable. Jonathan, can you imagine, historically, as you well know, coming from finance, the 10-year Treasury was at about 5.7% in the post-World War II era. Today, it's 2.9%. Can you imagine what interest on the debt would be if we had normal market interest rates?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's one of those things that I think people forget about is that we're sort of living in very exceptional and very atypical times, and if we're not doing well given where interest rates are today, how are things going to look when interest rates rise from a budgetary perspective? And so that's you're right, that as bad as the deficit is the debt is right now, that's it's not going to look any better when interest rates end up moving toward historical norms.
So the fact of the matter is we've got to get a handle on spending, which nobody wants to do. Coming out of the Bush administration for 8 years came the growth of what we call big government conservatives. Now, that's one of the classic oxymorons, but they're out there. And unfortunately, for the Republican Party, if they don't get a handle on these people, the number of independents are simply going to grow. You saw the latest Gallup poll where 42% now define themselves as political independents. It's my view that people look at this who are not immersed in this stuff like you are and I am, but they look at this from afar and they say, well, the Democrats want to increase spending on welfare and all and smart growth and mass transit. The Republicans want to increase spending on the Pentagon and farm subsidies and pensions for certain select public employees. They don't see any difference between the two.
I think that's right. I think the picture that you just painted is historically true, right? I mean, if you look back to, Franklin Delano Roosevelt or LBJ, right, the focus was always on social programs. But the reality is that today both parties want to spend on both social programs and the Pentagon budget, and that's a big problem, of course, because we don't have the funds to be able to do that. And so I think most Americans understand what's going on. I think the big problem is that they don't know what they can do about it, and so that's that's what we're obviously aiming to change. But that's the status quo right now. Is instead of coming together and saying I'll cut my sacred cow if you cut your sacred cow, they come together and say you vote for my spending and I'll vote for yours, and we'll walk all the way to the bank.
No, that's historically been it. Exactly, and that's why the sequester was so wonderful. But here's the other myth that people have to understand. You've got internationalists like John Kerry, and for that matter, President Obama should have proven this completely. The idea that Democrats don't want to throw money at the Pentagon is a myth too. They love Department of State spending. They love micromanaging abroad. Now, they'll turn it into another appendage of the welfare state by offering benefits and more civilian employment. But nevertheless, these guys are internationalists. There's an establishment party, and then there's the rest of us. And the establishment, and no place was this more evident than undoing the sequester, doesn't like spending reduction.
Well, and that's right. And conservatives make a very strong argument as to why we don't want government involved in a lot of things, right? And it's all the reasons we've already talked about. Government agencies and departments are inefficient. They receive no price signals, and so they just don't face the same incentives as private people in the private sector. Well, the thing is, all of those same critiques that you would levy on the Department of Education or the Department of Agriculture also exist at the Pentagon. The Pentagon is just another government department, and so the same problems exist there. And the irony is that, of course, neither side today really seems to acknowledge that, and that's something that absolutely has to change if we're ever going to get our fiscal house.
Well, as Robert Gates, who's everybody's hero on the conservative right this week, said, if we can't defend the country on $500 billion, we've got other problems. And anybody who's been in the military, I have two brothers in the military, and I asked them, "Do you think there's any room to cut spending?" And they start laughing. So of course you can't. And it got so bad that I can't remember who the congressman was from a district in Virginia which received a lot of military spending. But he and even Romney were running around the country saying, "Oh, what will happen to the multiplier effect?" They were Keynesians. If we cut military spending, they were making the exact same argument for defense spending as Obama was making for social spending.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, we're, of course, based here in Alexandria, Virginia, and then last election cycle, George Allen, who was running for Senate, did just that, and ran television ads saying, that if we reduce the Pentagon's budget, Northern Virginia is going to suffer and lose jobs and what have you. And you're exactly right. It's the exact same argument that's made with all domestic programs.
So here we had, coming out of the Budget Control Act, and that was the debt ceiling showdown in 2011, as I recall, or maybe it was 2012.
2011, that's right.
Was it 11?
Yep.
It was 11. So they agreed on a task force, of which everybody knew they'd come out with something, but they wouldn't agree on that. So at one particular time, it actually worked. The Republicans, by accident, backed Obama into a corner, and he agreed to cut spending across the board, $500 billion, $1 trillion in spending over a decade, if they couldn't agree in exchange for raising the debt ceiling. So lo and behold, they couldn't agree. The debt ceiling was raised, but so were the spending cuts or the budget sequester. And as you pointed out, for 2 years, we actually had real aggregate cuts, or not just aggregate cuts, actually real cuts in government spending. And we were going to get a real whopper this month. So no wonder they're in the process of undoing it as we speak.
Yep, and I think the thing I'll add to that is that look, I mean, sequestration was not necessarily anyone's sort of ideal way of cutting spending. But that said, it is the greatest example we have in modern times when it comes to the sort of fake, harm that comes when you reduce spending. I mean, if you remember the run-up to the, in this whole debate, the discussion was that if we enact sequestration, if we make these cuts, which of course weren't even real cuts, they were just cuts to a baseline anyway, that we were going to end up having, the world was going to fall completely apart. And the reality is, of course, we woke up the next morning and everything was fine. And the only people who really seemed to be affected were a couple of people in D.C. And so that is actually, I think, the real power of the sequester is that it's a great illustration that, when you reduce spending, these sort of, arguments
austerity
from
works.
Paul Krugman's of the world are
right.
just not, don't really happen.
Hey, you look abroad, in those countries that have adopted austerity are actually doing the best. I happen to think it's the only way politically to get spending cut, too. You're not going to get it by saying, I'll cut your program, but I'm going to keep mine going. Everybody's got to have some skin in the game. And if they do, it puts pressure on the other guy to come along. Let's continue on the other side. Jonathan Bydlak is the president of the Coalition to Reduce Spending. We'll find out from Jonathan where you can contact these folks when we return.